The wind did not simply blow across the Wyoming Territory in the late 1870s. It scoured. It was a physical weight, a relentless hand that stripped the paint from wagons, the bark from cottonwoods, and the hope from anyone foolish enough to believe the West was a land of easy promise. Here, the earth was hardpan, cracked and thirsty, stretching out in every direction until it collided with the jagged, tooth-like blue of the distant mountains. Dust devils twisted across the open range like uneasy spirits, dancing in the silence before collapsing back into the grit. The town of Iron Creek clung to the edge of the railroad tracks, and the cattle trade was like a barnacle on the hull of a ship. It was not a place of beauty. It was a collection of peeling wooden buildings, false fronts grayed by the sun, and a single main street that turned to gumbo mud in the spring and rock-hard ruts in the winter. The air always smelled of coal smoke, manure, and the metallic tang of coming snow. It was late autumn now, the time of year when the sky turned the color of a bruised plum, and the frost did not melt until noon. Everyone in Iron Creek lived on a thin edge, waiting for the blizzards that killed cattle where they stood, or the drought that turned the grass to tinder. Eliza Ward stood behind the counter of Abernathy's general store, her hands trembling slightly as she weighed a pound of coffee beans for Mrs. Gable. The bell above the door chimed, letting in a gust of bitter air and two cattlemen, but Eliza kept her eyes fixed on the brass scales. She was 22 years old, with hair the color of dark walnut and eyes that had once been quick to smile, but now she wore her expression like a mask, carefully blank and polite. Mrs. Gable, a woman with a face like a dried apple and a bonnet stiff with starch, watched Eliza's movements with the scrutiny of a hawk. "That will be 15 cents, ma'am," Eliza said softly, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "Mrs." Gable placed the coins on the counter, not in Eliza's open palm, dropping them so they clattered against the wood. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a stage whisper that was meant to be heard by the men near the stove. "I heard the banker's wife say they are sending to Denver for new linens. I suppose some stains just never wash out. Do they, Miss Ward?" The heat flushed up Eliza's neck, burning her skin. She knew exactly what stains Mrs. Gable meant. It had been 3 months since the afternoon in the back office of the bank. 3 months since Caleb Thorne, the banker's son, had cornered her while she was delivering a deposit for the store. The memory hit her like a physical blow. A sudden, sharp intrusion of the past. She could smell the bay rum Caleb wore, sweet and cloying, and the scent of stale cigar smoke trapped in the heavy velvet drapes of the office. She remembered the way he had smiled, locking the door, telling her that a girl with no family and no fortune ought to be friendlier if she wanted to get by in this town. She remembered the struggle, the tearing of her sleeve, her own muffled cry as his hand clamped over her mouth, and then the aftermath, the terror of running to Mr. Thorne, the father, weeping and shaking, believing that justice existed, but Mr. Thorne had simply looked at her disheveled dress and his son's scratched face. He had called in the Reverend Silas. Together, they had rewritten the history of that hour. They said she had tempted Caleb. They said she was a fortune hunter, a seductress who had tried to entrap a wealthy heir and then cried wolf when her schemes failed. "Here's your coffee, Mrs. Gable," Eliza said, pushing the paper-wrapped parcel across the counter. She refused to weep. She had shed all her tears in the first week, when the invitations stopped coming, when men on the street began to look at her with a sickening, assessing familiarity. Mrs. Gable snatched the package and swept out, leaving the door ajar. The whispers from the men by the stove grew louder. "Bold as brass," one muttered, "working here like nothing happened." Mr. Abernathy, the store owner, emerged from the back room. He was a round, nervous man who was constantly wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. Today, he looked paler than usual. He wrung his hands, avoiding Eliza's gaze as he pretended to rearrange a stack of wool blankets. "Eliza," he said, his voice cracking. "Miss Ward?" "Yes, Mr. Abernathy?" She turned to him. and she saw the answer in the slump of his shoulders before he even spoke. "I had a visit this morning," he said, staring at a jar of peppermint sticks. "From Mr. Thorne. He holds the note in the store. You know, the mortgage comes due in January." "I understand," Eliza said. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. "I can work later, Mr. Abernathy. I can scrub the floors at night. I will take lower wages." "It is not the wages, girl," Abernathy snapped, his guilt making him sharp. "He says it is unseemly. He says decent women do not want to shop where a woman of your character is employed. He says if I keep you, he will call in the loan next week." Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. "Mr. Abernathy, I have nowhere to go. I have no savings left. I am sorry," he mumbled, finally looking at her. His eyes were wet, but his jaw was set in the stubbornness of a man trying to save his own skin. "You have to go, now. Take your pay from the till, $2 for the week, and go." 10 minutes later, Eliza was on the boardwalk, the wind cutting through her shawl. She had $2 silver in her pocket and a heavy stone in her chest. She walked toward the boarding house where she had lived for 2 years, hoping against hope that Mrs. Higgins would have more mercy than the merchant. She was wrong. By the time Eliza reached the boarding house, the news of her dismissal had apparently flown on the wind. Mrs. Higgins met her at the door, barring the entrance with her formidable bulk. Behind her, on the porch, sat Eliza's carpet bag. It was a small tapestry bag, worn at the corners. It contained everything she owned in the world: 2 dresses, a Bible that had belonged to her mother, a hairbrush, and a locket with a broken clasp. "I cannot have you here," Mrs. Higgins said, crossing her arms. "The other boarders are complaining. It is not a house for that sort." "I have paid my rent through the end of the month," Eliza argued, her voice trembling. "Please, Mrs. Higgins, it is going to snow tonight. Just let me stay until I can find a wagon leaving town." "I run a respectable establishment," the landlady said, though her eyes flickered with a momentary shame. "You can take your money back for the week remaining." She thrust a few coins at Eliza. "Now go on, before the Reverend sees you on my porch." The door slammed shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet street. Eliza stood alone on the porch. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and blood red. The wind picked up, whistling through the eaves. She picked up her bag. It felt impossibly light, as if her entire life amounted to nothing more than a few pounds of cloth and memory. She stepped off the porch and into the mud, feeling the eyes of the town burning into her back. A curtain twitched in a window across the street. A dog barked. She kept her head high, staring straight ahead, but inside, she was screaming. Half an hour later, a wagon rolled into the south end of town. It was a sturdy buckboard, pulled by 2 roan horses that had seen many winters. The man holding the reins sat with the ease of someone who had spent more of his life in the saddle than on his feet. Jonah Hale was not a man who drew attention to himself. Yet there was a quality about him that made men step aside when he walked down the boardwalk. He was perhaps 32 years old, though the lines around his eyes and the streaks of gray in his dark beard made him look older. He wore a coat of heavy buffalo hide, worn slick at the elbows, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the glare. He pulled the team to a halt in front of the livery stable and climbed down. He moved with a deliberate, heavy grace, checking the horse's hooves before he even looked at the town. Jonah lived 15 miles out, on a patch of land that backed up against the foothills. It was a lonely place, a place where a man could go days without hearing a human voice. And that was exactly how Jonah liked it. He walked toward the supply store, his spurs chinking softly in the dirt. He kept his gaze on the ground or the horizon, never meeting the eyes of the people he passed. Iron Creek tolerated Jonah Hale, but they did not embrace him. They knew the stories. They whispered that he had come up from Texas trailing a dark cloud. They said the Hale blood ran hot and violent. They said he had killed his own brother on a cattle drive near the Red River, that he had put a knife in his own kin's heart. Jonah knew the whispers. He never denied them. The truth was a burden he carried in the slope of his shoulders, a weight far heavier than the sacks of grain he was here to buy. He believed the town was right to be wary of him. He was a man marked by violence, and he had sentenced himself to solitude as a penance that had no end. He entered the general store just as the sun finally vanished. The interior was dim, lit by the sputtering yellow glow of kerosene lamps. The air smelled of sawdust and pickle brine. He moved to the back, gathering what he needed: a keg of nails, a sack of coffee, a box of cartridges. He spoke only when necessary, his voice a low rumble. 5 pounds of salt pork, he told the clerk, a pimply boy who had replaced Eliza behind the counter. As he waited, the door opened again. A woman slipped in. It was Eliza. Jonah had seen her before. He had seen her working here, moving with a quiet efficiency that he admired. He knew who she was. He heard the gossip, though he never participated in it. He knew they called her ruined. He knew they said she was a liar. When he looked at her, he did not see a liar. He saw a terrified animal cornered by wolves. She was struggling to lift a sack of flour onto the counter. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. "Mr. Abernathy," she said to the owner, who was hiding near the stove. I cannot keep this. I need to return it. I need the money back." Abernathy looked pained. "We do not usually do refunds, Miss Ward." "Please," she said. The single word was brittle, like dry glass. Jonah watched from the shadows of the dry goods aisle. He saw the way her hands shook. He saw the thinness of her cloak. She had returned the flour because she had no job. And a sack of flour was a luxury when you did not know where you would sleep. Abernathy grunted and slapped 50 cents on the counter. Eliza took the coin, her head bowed. As she turned to leave, she nearly collided with Jonah. She gasped, stepping back, clutching her reticule to her chest. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and startled. For a second, the rest of the room fell away. Jonah looked into her face and saw a depth of despair that mirrored his own. He saw the exhaustion of someone fighting a war they had already lost. He did not smile, he had forgotten how, but he nodded. It was a small, sharp dipping of his chin, a gesture of respect, or perhaps just acknowledgement. "I see you," it said. "I see you are still standing." Eliza blinked, confused by the lack of malice in his dark eyes. Then the shame rushed back in. She ducked her head, her cheeks flushing a painful crimson, and hurried out the door into the gathering night. "Good riddance," a man by the stove spat, chewing on a plug of tobacco. "I told my wife she ought to run out on a rail. Bring whatever is coming to her, if you ask me. Strutting around tempting decent men." Jonah stiffened. His hand, resting on the crate of cartridges, tightened until the knuckles turned white. He slowly turned his head to look at the speaker. The man was big, paunchy, with grease in his beard. Jonah said nothing. He simply looked at the man. He looked at him with the flat, dead stare of a man who had watched the life go out of his own brother's eyes. The silence in the store stretched, thin and taut as a wire. The man by the stove swallowed hard, suddenly finding the floor very interesting. Jonah paid for his goods and walked out into the cold. Night had fully claimed the town. The temperature plummeted, the wind turning from a gale into a knife. The stars overhead were hard and bright, indifferent to the suffering below. Eliza had nowhere to go. She had tried the livery stable first, hoping to curl up in the straw of an empty stall, just for a few hours. But the stable hand, a nervous boy named Tim, who was terrified of losing his position, had found her. "You can't be here, Miss Eliza," he stammered, holding a pitchfork like a weapon. "The boss said. He said no vagrants. Especially not you. Please, you gotta go." She had left without a word. Now, she was huddled in the narrow alley behind the livery, wedged between the rough pine boards of the wall and a stack of rotting hay bales. It was the only shelter she could find that offered any protection from the wind. She sat on her carpet bag, drawing her knees to her chest. Her cloak was wool, but it was thin, meant for autumn church services. Not a winter night on the ground. The cold began to seep into her bones immediately. It started in her toes, a dull ache that turned to numbness, then crept up her legs. Her fingers were stiff, clumsy claws tucked into her armpits. Hunger gnawed at her belly, a hollow, cramping pain. She had not eaten since breakfast. She closed her eyes, and the tears she had held back all day finally froze on her lashes. Her mind began to drift, unmoored by the cold. She thought of her parents, back in Ohio. She remembered the lace curtains in her mother's parlor, the smell of yeast rolls rising in the kitchen. They had died of the fever 3 years ago, leaving her alone. She had come west answering an advertisement for a teacher, only to find the schoolhouse had burned down and the job was gone. She had taken the clerk position to survive. I tried, she thought, her teeth chattering in a violent rhythm. I tried to be good. I tried to be honest. The injustice of it choked her. She had been the victim, and they had made her the villain. She wondered, with a detached curiosity, if this was how she would die, frozen stiff behind a stable in a town that hated her. It seemed terribly lonely. She tucked her head down, burying her face in her knees, and drifted into a dangerous, dozing stupor. It was an hour later when Jonah finished loading his wagon. He had taken his time, checking the harness, double-checking the lashing on the supplies. He delayed because the thought of the empty ranch house awaiting him was heavier than usual tonight. He led the horses out of the main bay of the livery, intending to mount the wagon seat in the street. As he walked around the side of the building to check the rear wheel, his boot struck something soft. He stopped, his hand dropping instinctively to the Colt Navy revolver at his hip. "Who is there?" he demanded, his voice raspy. There was no answer, just a faint, ragged sound, a breath. Jonah squinted into the gloom. A shape lay wedged against the wall, a bundle of dark fabric. He crouched down, the leather of his coat creaking. He reached out and touched the shoulder of the figure. Eliza flinched so violently she nearly struck her head against the wall. Her eyes flew open, wide and glassy with terror, when she saw the large, dark silhouette looming over her. She let out a small, strangled whimper and tried to scramble backward, but her limbs were too stiff to obey. "Easy," Jonah said. He held his hands up, palms out. "Easy now?" He saw who it was. The recognition hit him hard. This was the girl from the store, the banker's victim. She was shivering so hard her teeth clicked together audibly. Her skin was the color of skimmed milk. Her lips blue. "You are freezing," Jonah said. It was a statement of fact, devoid of judgment. I... Her voice was frozen in her throat. "I have nowhere." "Well, you cannot stay here," Jonah said. "You will be dead by morning." A shadow fell over them. A man stumbled out of the back door of the saloon nearby, reeking of whiskey. He swayed, peering at Jonah and Eliza. "Well, look at that," the drunk slurred, laughing wetly. "The killer and the whore, a match made in hell, ain't it? Why don't you leave the town whore where she belongs? Hale? In the dirt?" Jonah stood up. He rose to his full height, towering over the drunk. He did not shout. He did not draw his gun. He simply turned his head and fixed the man with a look of such concentrated, icy menace that the drunk's laughter died in his throat. Jonah's jaw was a ridge of granite. "Walk away," Jonah said softly. "While you still have legs to carry you." The drunk blinked, swallowed, and stumbled backward, retreating into the darkness as fast as his unsteady feet would allow. Jonah turned back to Eliza. He unbuttoned his heavy buffalo coat. "No," Eliza whispered, her teeth chattering. "I cannot. I will cause trouble for you." "Trouble and I are old friends," Jonah said. He pulled the coat off and draped it around her. The heavy, animal warmth of it enveloped her, smelling of tobacco and horse and man. It was the warmest thing she had felt in months. He did not ask for permission. He bent down and scooped her up into his arms. She was frighteningly light, like a bird made of hollow bones. She stiffened, bracing for cruelty, but his hold was firm and surprisingly gentle. He held her as if she were something breakable that needed to be kept whole. He carried her to the wagon. As he reached the street, a tall, severe figure stepped out from the shadows of the churchyard. It was Reverend Silas, his black coat blending with the night, his face pale and rigid. The preacher blocked Jonah's path to the wagon. "Mr. Hale," Silas said, his voice ringing with practiced authority. "I see you have collected the refuse of our community." Jonah stopped. Eliza cradled against his chest. She buried her face in his shirt, shaking with shame. "She is a human being, Reverend," Jonah said, "and she is freezing to death." "She is a woman of loose morals," Silas intoned, "a temptress who has led a good man's son astray. If you take her in, Jonah Hale, you invite sin into your house. You will stain your soul beyond the redemption it already seeks." Jonah looked at the preacher. The wind whipped Jonah's hair across his eyes, but his gaze remained steady. "My soul is my own concern, preacher," Jonah replied. His voice was flat, final. "And I reckon the Lord has more to say about leaving a woman to die in the cold than he does about your gossip." He stepped around the preacher, ignoring the man's gasp of indignation. He walked to the wagon and lifted Eliza onto the seat. He climbed up beside her, taking the reins. He wrapped a wool blanket over her legs, tucking it in tight. Then he slapped the reins against the horse's rumps. "Get up!" The wagon lurched forward, the iron wheels grinding against the frozen mud. As they left the town behind, the lights of Iron Creek fading into the distance. Silence descended again. Eliza was half-conscious, her mind blurring between the cold and the sudden, overwhelming heat of the coat. She felt the steady, rocking motion of the wagon. She smelled the leather of the harness and the sweat of the horses. But mostly, she felt the solid presence of the man beside her. He had one arm braced against the seat back, propping her up so she wouldn't slide. He was a wall between her and the wind, for the first time in months. Eliza Ward closed her eyes and did not see the face of the banker's son. She felt only the rough wool of a stranger's coat and the surprising warmth of being saved. Overhead, the sky was a vast, indifferent dome of black scattered with stars like chips of ice, watching as the wagon rolled into the dark, vast emptiness of the plains. Dawn broke over the Wyoming basin not with a burst of gold, but with the sullen color of bruised iron. The light crept reluctantly across the plains, revealing a landscape stripped bare by the relentless wind. It was a stark, unforgiving view that greeted the morning. To the west, the mountains rose like jagged teeth against the pale sky, their peaks already shrouded in heavy clouds that promised nothing but hardship. The ranch lay in the shadow of these foothills, a small, defiant scratch on the vast surface of the earth. The house was low and squat, built of rough-hewn logs that had weathered to the color of driftwood. To the left stood a barn that leaned wearily to the south, propped up by stubborn timbers and hope. Fences sagged across the hard, frozen ground, the wire singing a high, mournful note in the breeze. A thin ribbon of creek, half choked with ice, wound its way behind the structures, black water gurgling beneath the frozen crust. Jonah Hale moved through this gray world with the practiced efficiency of a man who had long ago learned that the land did not care if he lived or died. He was already outside, breaking the ice on the trough for the 2 horses and the small herd of cattle that huddled near the windbreak. His breath puffed out in white clouds, snatched away instantly by the cold. He did not look at the house. He worked with his head down, shoulders hunched against the bite of the air, doing the chores that kept chaos at bay. Inside the house, silence reigned until a gasp shattered it. Eliza Ward woke with a start, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She sat up violently, the movement sending a wave of dizziness washing over her. She was not in the alley behind the livery. She was not shivering in the mud. She was in a bed, a real bed with a mattress of ticking stuffed with straw, buried under a heavy mound of wool blankets and a familiar buffalo hide coat. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her throat. Her hands flew to her chest, checking her collar. Her dress was wrinkled and damp at the hem, but it was buttoned. She was clothed. She was whole. Her eyes darted around the room. It was a single large space, serving as kitchen, parlor, and bedroom all in one. The walls were unadorned logs, the chinking thick and solid. A cast-iron stove in the center radiated a fierce, dry heat, and the smell of burning pine and brewing coffee hung heavy in the air. In the corner, sitting in a straight-backed wooden chair with his arms crossed over his chest, was the man from the store. Jonah Hale. He was awake. He looked as though he had been awake for hours, or perhaps he had never slept at all. His dark eyes were fixed on the stove door, but as soon as she stirred, his gaze shifted to her. He did not smile. He did not move to approach her. He simply watched her with an expression that was unreadable. "You are safe," he said. His voice was rough, like gravel shifting under a boot, but the volume was low. Eliza pulled the buffalo coat tighter around her neck, her knuckles white. "Where am I? Why am I here?" "You were freezing to death behind the livery," Jonah said, stating the facts as if he were reading from a ledger. "I brought you out to my place. It is about 15 miles from town." Eliza's memory lurched back into focus. The cold, the drunk man jeering, the sensation of being lifted, the preacher's condemnation. "You should not have done that," she whispered, looking down at the rough wool of the blanket. "The Reverend said, they said it would bring you trouble." "I reckon I can handle my own trouble," Jonah said. He stood up, and Eliza flinched, pressing her back against the rough wooden headboard. Jonah stopped immediately. He held his hands out slightly, palms open, showing he held no weapon and no intent to harm. "I am just getting the coffee. Ma'am, I have no intention of coming closer than the stove." Eliza watched him warily as he poured a dark stream of liquid into a tin cup. He set it on the edge of the table, well within her reach, but far enough that he did not have to hand it to her directly. Then he retreated to the window, staring out at the bleak morning. "I slept in the chair," he said, his back to her. "You had a chill deep in your bones. You needed the bed to get the warmth back into you. Nothing else happened." "You have my word on that, for whatever it is worth to you." Eliza reached for the cup. The heat of the tin seared her cold fingertips, a painful but welcome sensation. She took a sip. It was bitter and strong enough to make her eyes water, but it scalded the icy knot in her stomach. "Thank you," she said. The words felt inadequate, tiny things against the magnitude of what he had done. "I do not understand why you would help me. You know who I am. You know what they say." Jonah turned from the window. The morning light caught the gray in his beard and the deep lines etched around his mouth. "I know what it is like to be cold," he said simply. "And I know what it is like to have a town look through you like you are not there." He walked over to the stove and picked up his hat, pulling it low over his eyes. "There is salt pork and biscuits in the pan. Eat. Stay until you are warm. We can figure out the rest later." With that, he opened the heavy door and stepped out into the biting wind, closing it firmly behind him. Eliza did not leave that day, nor the next. The arrangement formed between them not with words, but with a series of quiet concessions. By the second day, Eliza was strong enough to stand without her legs trembling. She found a broom in the corner and swept the floor until the rough planks looked as clean as a church aisle. When Jonah came in at midday, tracking snow and mud, he stopped, looking at the clean floor, then at Eliza, who stood by the stove with her hands clasped before her. "I cannot pay you for the food or the shelter," Eliza said, her chin lifted slightly. "And I will not take charity. I am not a beggar. Mr. Hale." Jonah removed his hat, tapping the snow off the brim against his leg. "I never said you were." "I will work," she insisted. "I can cook better than whatever you have been making in that skillet. I can mend. I see the tear in your coat sleeve, and your shirt collar is fraying. I will earn my keep until I can find a position in another town." Jonah looked at her for a long moment. He seemed to be weighing her fragility against the steel he saw in her eyes. He nodded once. "Fair enough. I expect honesty, Miss Ward, and I expect you to pull your weight if you are able. Life out here does not carry passengers." "I am no passenger," she said fiercely. So it began. A fragile, uneasy truce settled over the small house. They moved around each other like two repelling magnets, maintaining a careful distance in the cramped quarters. When he moved right, she moved left. When he sat at the table, she busied herself at the wash basin. Jonah was a man of silence. He spoke only when necessary, his sentences stripped of all ornamentation. He would say, "Wood is low," or "Wind is shifting north." He did not ask about her past. He did not ask why the banker's son had cornered her, or why the town had turned so vicious. He treated her with a distant, gruff courtesy, like a neighbor he barely knew. Eliza found his silence both maddening and relieving. She was terrified he would ask, terrified she would have to recount the shame again. But he never did. The days grew shorter as November bled into December. The sun became a rare visitor, a pale coin tossing weak light over the frozen prairie. The air grew so sharp it hurt to breathe. Then, the first true blizzard of the winter struck. It began in the afternoon, the sky turning a bruised purple-black. The wind picked up, screaming around the corners of the cabin, rattling the shutters. By nightfall, the snow was driving horizontal, a white curtain that erased the world. They were trapped. The cabin, which had felt small before, now felt microscopic. The storm slammed against the walls with the force of a physical assault, shaking the timbers. Snow piled up against the door, drifting higher with every hour. "We will not be going out for a few days," Jonah said, barring the door with a heavy piece of oak. He turned to face the room. The wind howled outside, a lonely, terrifying sound that made the fire in the stove seem incredibly precious. For 3 days, the storm raged. They were forced into an intimacy neither had asked for. Eliza took over the domestic sphere completely. She nursed the fire with a miser's care, counting every log. She took Jonah's shirts, worn thin at the elbows and frayed at the cuffs, and sat by the window's gray light, stitching them with tiny, precise movements. She cooked stews from dried beans and salted meat, using herbs she found in dried jars on a high shelf to coax flavor from the simple ingredients. Jonah, unable to work outside, was restless. He paced the small floor, checking the window every 10 minutes. He oiled his tack, the smell of leather and grease filling the room. He sharpened his knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic shh sound becoming a heartbeat in the quiet house. The sleeping arrangements remained the same, though the tension of it grew with the confinement. "Take the bed," Jonah said the first night of the storm, throwing a blanket onto the floor near the stove. "Mr. Hale, you cannot sleep on the floor," Eliza protested, standing by the bed with her arms wrapped around herself. "It is your house. It is your bed. I can sleep in the chair. The floor is warmer. Heat rises, but the draft catches you in the chair." Jonah lied smoothly, spreading the blanket. "Besides, I have slept on harder ground than this pine floor. Go to sleep, Eliza." It was the first time he had used her first name without the formal title. It hung in the air between them. She lay in his bed, smelling the scent of him in the pillow, sagebrush, wood smoke, and rain. She listened to his breathing in the dark, steady and deep, while the wind shrieked outside like a dying animal. Guilt gnawed at her. She was the intruder here. She was the ruined woman who had been cast out, and this man, this killer with the dark reputation, was giving her his bed and sleeping on the floor like a dog. She did not deserve it. The town had told her she deserved nothing but the cold. On the second evening of the storm, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. The wind was still howling, but the fire was roaring, casting a golden, flickering light over the room. They sat at the small wooden table. Jonah was clumsily trying to punch a new hole in a leather bridle strap with an awl. Eliza was sewing a button onto his flannel shirt. The silence was heavy, but for the first time, it was not entirely uncomfortable. It was a shared shelter against the chaos outside. Eliza's hand slipped. The needle drove deep into the pad of her index finger. She gasped, dropping the shirt. "Oh!" Jonah looked up instantly. He saw her flinch, saw her bring her hand to her mouth. He dropped the bridle and reached across the table. "Let me see," he said. Before she could pull away, he took her hand. His hand was massive, the skin rough and stained with work, calloused hard as wood. Her hand looked impossibly small and white in his grip. He turned her finger over, inspecting the small bead of bright red blood that welled up. He reached for a clean rag he kept by his tools and gently dabbed the blood away. His thumb brushed against her palm. The contact was electric. It was a shock that started in her hand and shot straight to her chest. It had been so long since a man had touched her with anything other than lust or contempt. Caleb had grabbed her with bruising force. The store owner had avoided touching her at all, as if she were diseased. But this was care. It was a rough, clumsy tenderness. Eliza stared at his bent head, at the dark hair falling over his forehead. For a second, the air in the room felt too thin. Her heart did a strange, treacherous flip. She pulled her hand back abruptly. Jonah froze. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. He saw the fear that had flashed in her gaze, the reflex of a hunted thing. "I am sorry," he said, his voice dropping. He pulled his hands back to his side of the table, curling them into fists. "I did not mean to startle you. It is fine," Eliza said, her voice shaking. She picked up the needle, but her fingers were trembling too badly to thread it. It is just a scratch." She looked down at her lap. The warmth of his hand still lingered on her skin, a phantom sensation. She felt a sudden, confusing rush of gratitude mixed with a terrifying yearning. She wanted him to take her hand again. She wanted to be held. The realization made her stomach twist with shame. "You are ruined," the voice in her head whispered. "Do not think of such things." Jonah cleared his throat and picked up the awl again, driving it into the leather with unnecessary force. "I used to ride trails," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. He did not look at her. "Down south, Texas to Kansas." Eliza looked up, grateful for the distraction. "Is that where you are from?" "Texas. Mostly," Jonah said. "My brother and I, we rode in the Circle J outfit." He paused, the tool still in his hand. "His name was Samuel. He was a big man, charming, could charm a bird out of a tree. Samuel could—" He laughed loudly and he rode hard. Jonah's face darkened, the firelight casting deep shadows in the hollows of his cheeks. He liked trouble too much. The whiskey, the cards, the women. He thought the world owed him whatever he wanted to take. He stopped there. He did not tell her about the night by the Red River. He did not tell her about the scream of the girl in the camp, or the way Samuel had laughed when Jonah tried to pull him off. He did not tell her about the knife, or the way Samuel's blood had felt hot and sticky on his hands. "He sounds difficult," Eliza said softly. "He was my brother," Jonah said, the words heavy with a complex grief. "And he is dead." He looked at her then, his gaze direct and piercing. "The town says I am the one who brought the bad luck. They say I have blood on my hands." Eliza hesitated. She smoothed the fabric of the shirt in her lap. "The town says many things, Mr. Hale. They say I am a liar. They say I tempted a man who did not need tempting." Jonah watched her. "Is that true? What do they say about you?" Eliza looked at the fire. She could feel the heat on her face. "They decided who I was the moment I walked into that bank without a father or a husband to speak for me. They decided I was not the kind of woman they wanted around." "That is not an answer," Jonah said gently. Eliza looked away, biting her lip. She could not say the words. She could not tell him the ugly, sordid truth of what happened in that office. If she told him, he would look at her with disgust. He would see her as soiled. "It is the only answer I have right now," she whispered. Jonah nodded slowly. He did not press her. He understood the need to keep demons locked away. "Fair enough," he said again. The silence that settled over them then was different. It was heavy, yes, weighted with the things they were not saying, but it was not hostile. It was a shared silence, a mutual recognition of scars. Outside, the wind battered the house, but inside, for the first time, Eliza felt safe. The storm broke on the fourth day, leaving the world buried under 3 feet of white powder. The temperature dropped even further, a bone-cracking cold that turned the air to glass. That night was the coldest yet. The fire in the stove fought a losing battle against the draft seeping through the chinking in the logs. The frost was forming on the inside of the window panes in fern-like patterns. Eliza sat by the stove, wrapped in her shawl, shivering uncontrollably. She had been trying to mend a tear in her skirt, but her fingers were too numb to hold the needle. Jonah was pacing again. He saw her shivering. He saw the way her jaw was clenched tight to stop her teeth from chattering. He walked over to the hook by the door and took down the buffalo coat. It was heavy, smelling of the storm and him. He walked up behind her. "Here," he said. He draped the coat over her shoulders. The weight of it settled on her, pressing her down. For a moment, he stood directly behind her. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, a solid wall of warmth against her back. She could hear the intake of his breath. His hands lingered for a fraction of a second on the shoulders of the coat, close to her neck. Eliza's body betrayed her. She stiffened, her muscles locking tight. It was the old terror, the memory of Caleb's hands on her shoulders, the feeling of being trapped. Jonah sensed the tension instantly. He stepped back as if he had been burned. I am sorry," he murmured, retreating into the shadows of the room. You were cold." Eliza grabbed the lapels of the coat, pulling it tight around her. The scent of him enveloped her. "No," she said, her voice breathless. She turned in the chair to look at him. He was standing by the table, looking at the floor, his posture rigid with self-reproach. "It is not you," she said quickly. I am just not used to kindness. Mr. Hale, it frightens me." Jonah looked at her, his eyes dark and unfathomable. "You should not be frightened of kindness. Eliza, it is the only thing worth anything in this world." He turned and walked to his pallet on the floor, lying down and turning his back to the room. Eliza stayed in the chair for a long time. The fire popped and hissed. She buried her nose in the collar of his coat, inhaling the scent of him. Her heart was racing, but as she sat there in the quiet dark, she realized with a jolt of shock that it was not just fear that made her pulse hammer. She remembered the heat of his body at her back. She remembered the size of his hands. And beneath the fear, beneath the shame, there was something else, an ache, a hollow, hungry longing to lean back against him, to let him wrap his arms around her and shut out the cold. She closed her eyes, horrifying herself. "He is a killer," the town whispered. "You are a ruined woman," the town shouted. She was broken. She had to be. No decent woman would feel this way about a rough, silent cowboy who carried a knife and a dark past. No decent woman would want a man's touch after what had been done to her. But she did. God help her, she did. On the floor, Jonah lay with his eyes wide open, staring into the darkness. He could hear the soft sound of her breathing. He could smell the faint scent of lavender soap that clung to her skin. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. He was a fool. He was a damned fool. He had brought a wounded bird into his house, and now he was terrified he would crush her. He had felt her stiffen when he came close. He knew she was afraid of him. And she should be. He had no right to want her. He had no right to want the softness of her voice or the light in her eyes. He was Jonah Hale, the man who had killed his own brother. He was tainted with blood and bad luck. He could offer her shelter. He could offer her food. But he could never offer her the one thing he found himself craving more than his next breath. He rolled over, pulling the thin blanket up to his chin, and squeezed his eyes shut, praying for sleep to take the hunger away. But the wind outside only laughed, lonely and cold, echoing the emptiness in his own chest. Winter clamped its jaws around the Wyoming territory, grinding the land between teeth of ice and iron. The days were short, brutal stretches of gray light that offered no warmth, only visibility. For Jonah and Eliza, time ceased to be measured in hours or minutes. It was measured in the amount of wood in the box, the level of grain in the sack, and the thickness of the ice on the creek. Survival became a liturgy of small, hard acts. Every morning began in the dark, the air inside the cabin so cold that the water in the bucket had a skin of ice. Jonah would rise first, his boots heavy on the floorboards, to stoke the stove. Eliza would wake to the sound of the iron door clanging shut and the smell of sulfur and pine. Her life, once measured in ribbons and ledger books, was now defined by the weight of a water pail and the resistance of frozen earth. She learned that carrying wood required balance, not just strength, stacking the logs against her hip to spare her arms. She learned that a stew could be stretched for 3 days if one added enough snowmelt and dried sage. She learned that wind was not just air, but a living thing that hunted for any gap in your clothing to slide a knife into your ribs. Jonah watched her. He did not say much, but his eyes followed her as she moved through the small space of his life. He saw the way her hands, once soft and white, grew red and chapped. He saw the way she bit her lip when she lifted the heavy cast-iron skillet, refusing to ask for help. She was not the fragile china doll the town had made her out to be. She was willow wood. Pliant, perhaps, but impossible to break. One morning, fiercely cold, Jonah was in the barn mending a tear in a saddle fender. Eliza came in, her shawl wrapped tight around her head, carrying a bucket of warm mash for the milk cow. "You should not be carrying that," Jonah said, not looking up from his work. "It is too heavy with the ice on the ground. The cow needs to eat." "Mr. Hale," Eliza replied, her voice muffled by wool. "And you have the fencing to see too." She moved past him, her boots crunching in the straw. Jonah stopped his stitching. He watched her pour the mash, scraping the sides of the bucket with a wooden paddle. She was efficient. She was stubborn, and despite the hell she had walked through, she held her head up. A quiet respect began to take root in his chest, growing alongside the pity he had felt at first. But the winter brought more than just cold. It brought a secret that Eliza could no longer hide. For weeks, she had felt the sickness rising in her throat. At first, she told herself it was the change in diet, the salt pork, the stress. But then her monthlies did not come. Then came the morning sickness, violent and retching, which she fought to stifle in the pillow so Jonah would not hear. She was terrified. If he knew, the fragile sanctuary she had found would surely shatter. A man might take in a stray woman out of charity, but to house a woman carrying another man's bastard, that was a shame few would bear. It happened on a Tuesday, when the wind had died down to a sullen whisper. Eliza was walking back from the creek, a bucket of water in each hand. The smell of the wet sagebrush hit her, and the world suddenly tilted on its axis. The nausea rose like a tide. She dropped the buckets. The water splashed over her boots, freezing instantly. But she did not notice. She doubled over, her hands clutching her stomach, and dry heaved into the snow. The spasms were relentless, shaking her frame until her knees gave way and she collapsed onto the frozen mud. "Eliza!" The shout was distant, then immediate. Jonah was there, dropping the armload of firewood he had been carrying. He fell to his knees beside her, his hands gripping her shoulders. "Eliza, breathe! What is it? Is it the fever?" She could not answer. She could only gasp, wiping her mouth with the back of her mitten. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and swimming with tears, and saw genuine terror in his face. He thought she was dying. "No," she wheezed. "No fever." "I am taking you inside." He scooped her up, ignoring the mud on her skirt, and carried her into the house. He set her down on the chair by the stove and immediately went to the water basin, dipping a rag in cool water. "Jonah, stop," she said. Her voice was thin, trembling. He turned, the wet rag in his hand. "You are sick. You are shaking like a leaf." "I am not sick," she whispered. She closed her eyes, tears leaking out from beneath the lashes. I am in a family way." The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the wind scratching at the window pane. Jonah stood perfectly still. He lowered the rag slowly to the table. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone. "The banker's son," Jonah said. It was not a question. Eliza nodded. Her head bowed so low her chin touched her chest. "Caleb Thorne, in the office. I told you he cornered me. I did not tell you the rest." The words came tumbling out then, a dam breaking. She told him about the locked door. She told him about the heavy velvet drapes and the smell of stale cigar smoke. She told him how she had fought, how she had begged, and how he had put his hand over her mouth and laughed as if it were a game. She told him about the baby growing inside her, a child made of violence and shame. "I will leave," she sobbed, her hands covering her face. "I know I cannot stay. I know it is too much to ask of any decent man. I will pack my things. I will go." Jonah did not move. His hands were resting on the back of the empty chair opposite her. His knuckles were white, the skin pulled so tight it looked ready to split. His jaw worked, a muscle jumping in his cheek. His eyes were dark, not with anger at her, but with a fury so cold and deep it terrified her more than shouting would have. He walked around the table. Eliza flinched, expecting a blow, or perhaps for him to drag her to the door. Instead, he knelt. He went down on one knee in front of her chair, bringing himself to her eye level. He reached out and took her hands, pulling them away from her tear-streaked face. His grip was firm, calloused, and warm. "Look at me," he commanded softly. Eliza forced her eyes open. She looked into his face and saw a storm there, but it was a storm directed outward, at the world that had hurt her. "It was not your fault," Jonah said. He spoke the words slowly, giving each one the weight of a stone. "Do you hear me, Eliza? What that man did, that is in his soul, not yours. You are not ruined. You are injured. There is a difference." Eliza stared at him. For months, the preacher had told her she was a temptress. The town had called her a liar. Her own heart had whispered that she was dirty. No one, not a single soul, had told her she was innocent. A sob ripped through her chest, a raw, ugly sound of grief. "Oh, God!" she cried. Jonah moved then. He reached forward and pulled her toward him. It was awkward, with him kneeling and her sitting, but he wrapped his arms around her waist and buried his face against her shoulder. She collapsed forward, her forehead resting on his heavy coat, her hands clutching the fabric at his back. She wept until she had no breath left, crying for the girl she had been and the woman she was forced to become. Jonah held her. He did not stroke her hair or hush her. He simply held her together, a solid, unmoving anchor in the center of her hurricane. He smelled of horses and wood smoke and safety. For the first time in her life, Eliza understood that a man's strength was not always a threat. Sometimes it was a shield. The revelation changed the air in the cabin. The secrecy was gone, replaced by a grim, shared reality. Jonah did not speak of the child often, but he began to do small things, putting an extra portion of meat on her plate, stopping her from lifting the heavy water buckets. But they could not hide from the world forever. The supplies were running low, the flour bin was scraping bottom, and the coffee was gone. "We have to go to town," Jonah announced 2 weeks later. "The storm has cleared enough to get the wagon through." Eliza felt a spike of fear, but she nodded. "I will make a list. You are coming with me," Jonah said. "No," she said quickly. "I cannot face them. Please, Jonah." "You are not a prisoner here," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "And I will not leave you alone out here for a full day, not in your condition. If the wolves come down from the foothills, you cannot shoot them off." So she went. She wrapped herself in her cloak and the buffalo coat Jonah insisted she wear, looking like a bundle of furs on the wagon seat. The ride into Iron Creek was long and silent. When they rolled onto the main street, it felt as if the temperature dropped 10 degrees. Heads turned, conversation stopped. Jonah pulled the wagon up to the general store. He tied the reins and turned to help her down, but she shook her head. "I will wait here," she said, pulling the scarf up to cover her nose and mouth. "I do not want to go inside." Jonah nodded and went in. Eliza sat on the high seat, feeling the eyes of the town crawling over her skin. 2 men were standing on the boardwalk near the saloon, smoking pipes. "Look at that," one said, loud enough for her to hear. Old Hale shaking up with the fallen woman. Two of a kind, I reckon. I heard she is swelling up. The other man laughed, a cruel, hacking sound. Raising another man's brat, though I suppose a killer like Hale is used to cleaning up messes that ain't his. Eliza stared straight ahead at the horse's ears, her gloved hands trembling in her lap. Do not cry, she told herself. Do not let them see you bleed. The door of the store opened, and Jonah stepped out, carrying a large wooden crate. He set it in the back of the wagon with a thud. He did not look at the men, but his shoulders were set in a hard line. The Reverend Silas stepped out of the mercantile, clutching a leather-bound Bible. He stopped when he saw Jonah. Mr. Hale, the preacher boomed. I trust you are satisfied with your choices. The town is talking. They say you are living in sin with that woman. Jonah turned slowly. He brushed a speck of dust from his sleeve. The town talks because their lives are empty, preacher, and you talk because you like the sound of your own voice. You are inviting judgment, Silas shouted, pointing a finger. You harbor a harlot, and now you intend to raise a child born of vice? You will be cursed. Jonah Hale, the land will spew you out. Jonah walked around the front of the wagon. He stopped 2 feet from the preacher. Jonah was not a tall man, but in that moment, he seemed to loom like a mountain. My house is my own, Jonah said. His voice was low, distinct, and carried no heat, which made it terrifying. And no man in this town, not you, not the banker, and not those cowards by the saloon, has the right to decide who freezes to death in the snow and who does not. You tend to your flock. Silas, leave the judging to God. I reckon he has better aim than you. He climbed onto the wagon, took the reins, and snapped them. The horses lurched forward. Eliza looked at Jonah's profile as they rattled out of town. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Thank you, she whispered. He did not look at her. Do not thank me for stating the truth, but she saw the way his hands gripped the leather reins, saw the tension radiating off him. He had stood between her and the world. Guilt washed over her. She was the cause of this hatred directed at him, but beneath it was a profound, overwhelming gratitude. Winter had one last vicious assault in its arsenal. 3 weeks after the trip to town, a blizzard struck in the middle of the night. It was a norther, a wind that screamed down from the Canadian flats with the force of a locomotive. Eliza was asleep in the bed when the sound woke her. A tearing crash. The wind had caught the heavy oak door, ripped the latch from the frame, and slammed it wide open. Snow swirled into the room instantly, a blinding white vortex in the darkness. The lamp had been blown out. Jonah! She screamed. Jonah was already moving, leaping up from his pallet on the floor. Stay back, he roared over the wind. He threw his shoulder against the door, fighting the invisible giant trying to force its way in. The wind was stronger than any man. His boots slipped on the snow that was already coating the floorboards. Eliza did not stay back. She scrambled out of bed, her bare feet hitting the freezing floor. She rushed to him. Push! Jonah yelled. She threw her weight against the wood alongside him. She was small, but her desperation gave her strength. Together, they heaved against the gale. Inch by inch, the door closed, cutting off the scream of the storm. Jonah slammed the crossbar down, his chest heaving. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. They stood there in the dark, panting, adrenaline coursing through their veins. The room was freezing, yet the air between them suddenly felt hot. Eliza was wearing only her white cotton nightgown. In her haste, she had grabbed her shawl, but it had slipped down to her elbows. Jonah was in his long johns, his chest heaving with exertion. They were standing close, too close. The darkness seemed to press them together. Eliza could hear the ragged sound of his breathing. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin, mere inches from hers. A stray gust of wind whistled through a crack, whipping a strand of her hair across her face. Jonah reached out, almost instinctively, to brush the hair away. His fingers grazed her cheek. The touch stopped time. Eliza looked up, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. She saw the outline of his face, the intense, dark stare fixed on her mouth. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not from fear of the storm, but from a sudden, piercing awareness of him as a man. She saw his head lower slightly. He leaned in. His breath ghosted across her lips, warm and smelling of sleep. She did not pull away. She wanted him to close the gap. She wanted to be consumed by something other than cold and shame. Then, Jonah jerked back. He stumbled a step away, his boots scraping loudly on the floor. He turned his back to her, bracing his hands against the door he had just barred. "Go to bed, Eliza," he rasped. His voice was strained, tight with something painful. "Go back to bed." Eliza stood there, shivering, her body humming with a rejected energy. She pulled her shawl up, covering herself. "Jonah, please," he said. It was a plea. She turned and fled to the bed, diving under the covers. She lay there, shaking, realizing with a terrifying clarity that she wanted him. She wanted his hands on her, not out of gratitude, not out of safety, but out of desire. The realization made her feel wanton, reckless, and yet, lying in the dark, listening to him pace by the door, she could not make herself regret it. Sleep was impossible. An hour later, Jonah relit the fire. The orange glow danced on the log walls, casting long, flickering shadows. Eliza sat up in bed, wrapping the quilt around her shoulders. Jonah was sitting on the floor by the hearth, staring into the flames, his arms resting on his knees. "I am sorry," Eliza whispered into the quiet. Jonah did not turn. "For what?" For being a burden. For bringing this shame to your door. You deserve a whole woman, Jonah. Not one who is broken, not one carrying another man's child." Jonah picked up a piece of kindling and snapped it in two. The sound was sharp, final. "Whole," he repeated, testing the word like a bad coin. He laughed softly, a bitter sound. "Eliza, you look at me and you see a man who saved you, but you do not know what I am. I know you are a good man," she said stubbornly. "I killed my brother," he said. The words hung in the air, absorbing the oxygen. Eliza went still. Jonah continued, speaking to the fire. "It was not a duel. It was not an accident. We were on a drive near the Red River. Samuel, he had been drinking for 2 days. There was a girl in the camp, a cook's daughter. She was 16. Eliza felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter. She pulled the quilt tighter. "He went after her," Jonah said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I heard her screaming. I ran to the wagon. He had her pinned. He was tearing at her dress. I tried to pull him off. He was big, stronger than me. He laughed and backhanded me. He said I should wait for my turn." Jonah dropped the broken kindling into the fire. Sparks flew up. "I had my knife. I did not think so. I drove it into him, under the ribs, straight into the heart." He looked at his hands, turning them over in the firelight. "He died looking at me. My own blood. The crew called it self-defense. They said he was wild, that it was bound to happen. But I know the truth. I killed the man I shared a cradle with." He finally turned to look at her. His eyes were wet, shining with a torture he had carried for years. "I am not whole. Eliza, I am cracked down the middle. I have blood on my hands that will never wash off. If anyone in this house is ruined, it is me." Eliza looked at him, and her heart broke wide open. She saw the guilt that had driven him into isolation. She saw that he believed he was a monster, and she understood, with a sudden, blinding clarity, why he had saved her, why he had been so gentle. He was not saving her. He was trying to balance a ledger that could never be balanced. She pushed the quilt aside. She walked across the cold floor to the hearth. She knelt beside him. "He was hurting her," Eliza said softly. "You stopped him. You did what no one did for me." Jonah flinched as if she had struck him. "You are not a monster, Jonah," she whispered. "You are the man who stops the monsters." Overcome by the darkness and the shared confession, Eliza reached out. She took his hand, the hand he believed was stained with sin. He did not pull away. He stared at their joined hands, his rough, scarred skin against her pale fingers. Slowly, with a terrifying uncertainty, Eliza leaned toward him. She moved inch by inch, giving him every chance to stop her, every chance to push her away. He did not. He turned his face toward hers. His eyes searched hers, looking for fear, looking for revulsion. He found only a fierce, tender sorrow. He met her halfway. The kiss was hesitant at first, a brushing of lips as light as a snowflake. It was a question asked and answered. Then, a low sound broke from Jonah's throat, a groan of surrender, and the kiss deepened. It was not the frantic, lustful grasping of a boy. It was the desperate connection of two people who had been starving in the cold. It tasted of salt and wood smoke. Jonah freed his hand and brought it up to cup her face. His thumb traced her cheekbone with a reverence that made her tremble. He held her as if she were made of spun glass, precious and rare. Eliza melted into him, her hands clutching the front of his shirt. For the first time since the bank, she did not feel dirty. She felt clean. She felt seen. The fire snapped and hissed beside them, throwing gold light over their joined forms. Jonah broke the kiss, breathing hard. He rested his forehead against hers. His eyes closed. His hands were shaking slightly where they held her face. "Eliza," he whispered, his voice ragged. I will never take from you what you do not give freely. You tell me to stop, and I stop. Always." "I know," she breathed. "I am afraid I will break you," he confessed. "I am already broken," she said, pulling back to look at him. "And so are you. Maybe the pieces fit." He looked at her then, and the haunted look in his eyes receded. Just a fraction. The desire between them was there, humming in the air like a struck tuning fork. But it was anchored now. It was no longer a frightening thing. It was a promise of warmth in a world that had offered them only ice. Jonah kissed her forehead, a benediction, and then pulled her against his chest. They sat there on the floor as the fire died down, holding onto each other while the wind howled outside. Two castaways who had finally found a shore. Spring arrived in the Wyoming territory, not with a gentle awakening, but with a violent unraveling. The silence of the deep freeze was replaced by the roar of water. The snow, which had held the land in a clean, white stasis for months, collapsed into a heavy, sucking mud that the locals called gumbo. It was thick, clay-heavy earth that clung to boots and wagon wheels with the tenacity of a starving dog. The creek behind the ranch house, usually a polite trickle, swelled into a brown torrent. It chewed at the banks, threatening to spill over into the lower pasture where the cattle had huddled for warmth all winter. "We have to move them," Jonah said one morning, staring out the window at the rising water. He drank his coffee standing up. "If that creek crests the bank, we will lose the calves." Eliza was already tying her apron, though the strings were becoming difficult to knot. Her belly had rounded significantly in the last month, a hard curve beneath her calico dress. She moved slower now, her hands often drifting to the small of her back, but her resolve had hardened along with the ground beneath the snow. "I will take the flank," she said, reaching for her shawl. Jonah frowned, his dark brows pulling together. "The mud is deep. Eliza, you could slip. Stay at home." "You cannot move 50 heads alone in this muck." "Jonah Hale," she countered, stepping into her boots. "And we cannot afford to lose a single calf." "I am coming." He looked at her, ready to argue, but he saw the set of her jaw. It was the same stubborn look she wore when she scrubbed the floor or mended a harness until her fingers bled. He nodded once. "Keep to the high ground near the fence line. Do not get in the middle of the herd." They worked for 4 hours under a pale, watery sun. The air was raw, smelling of wet sage and rotting grass. The cattle were balky, stupid with the remnants of winter lethargy, refusing to cross the slick patches of melting ice. Jonah rode his roan gelding, whistling and shouting, cutting back and forth to drive the stragglers. Eliza walked the fence line, waving a blanket to turn the cows back toward the ridge. She slipped twice. The second time, she went down on one knee. gasping as the mud sucked at her leg. Before she could even struggle to rise, Jonah was there. He had swung down from his horse while it was still moving. "I have got you," he grunted, his hands gripping her arms to haul her up. He did not let go immediately. He held her steady, his eyes scanning her face, dropping to her waist, then back up. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she insisted, though she was breathless. "Just clumsy." Jonah wiped a smear of mud from her cheek with his thumb. His touch was rough, but his eyes held a mixture of worry and a grudging, fierce admiration. "You are about as clumsy as a mountain cat, Eliza, but you are carrying a heavy load." "I am pulling my weight," she said, lifting her chin. "You are doing more than that," he said quietly. He squeezed her arms gently before stepping back. "We are almost done. Go on up to the porch. I will finish the gate." She watched him remount, her heart doing a slow, heavy thud in her chest. He treated her not like a broken thing anymore, but like a partner. It was a dangerous feeling. It made her want things she had no right to want. The trouble arrived 3 days later in the form of Tom Miller, their nearest neighbor. Miller was a skittish man with a good heart, but a weak spine. He rode into the yard just as the sun was setting, refusing to dismount. Jonah walked out to meet him, wiping grease from his hands on a rag. Eliza stood in the doorway, drying a plate. "Evening, Tom," Jonah said. "You look like you have a ghost on your trail." "Jonah?" Miller nodded, his eyes darting toward the house where Eliza stood. He lowered his voice, but the wind carried his words clearly enough. "I cannot stay. My wife, well, she would skin me if she knew I was here. But I thought you ought to know." "Know what?" Jonah asked, his posture stiffening. "The town," Miller said, twisting his reins. "The banker and the preacher had a meeting. They are stirring things up. Jonah, they are saying that woman. They are saying she is unfit, immoral. They are saying once the baby is born, the law ought to step in." Eliza felt the plate slip in her hands. She caught it against her stomach, her breath hitching. "Step in how?" Jonah asked. His voice was like the crack of a whip. "Take the child," Miller whispered. "Send it to an orphanage in Denver, and run her out of the territory for good. They say she is living in sin, and it is a stain on the community." Jonah took a step forward, his hand dropping to the colt at his hip, though he did not draw it. "Let them come. I will bury the first man who steps foot on this land with ill intent." "It is not just men with guns, Jonah," Miller warned. "It is the law. Judge Vance listens to the banker. If they bring a paper from the court, you cannot shoot a court order." Miller turned his horse. "I have said my piece. Watch your back. Hail." He rode off into the twilight. Jonah stood in the yard for a long time, staring at the empty road. When he turned back to the house, his face was a mask of thunder. Eliza was not in the doorway. She was sitting at the table, her face buried in her hands. The fear was a cold stone in her gut. They were going to take her baby, and they were going to destroy Jonah for trying to help her. She was the anchor dragging him down. She knew what she had to do. That night, the silence in the cabin was thick enough to choke on. Jonah sharpened his knife by the fire, the rhythmic shirk sound filling the room. Eliza went to bed early, feigning exhaustion. She lay in the dark, listening to his breathing slow as he fell asleep on his pallet. When she was sure he was deep in slumber, she rose. She moved like a ghost. She found her carpet bag, the same one she had arrived with. She packed her 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, and the few dollars she had saved from her time at the store. She put on her cloak and her boots. She looked at Jonah one last time in the dim light of the dying coals. He looked younger when he slept, the lines of pain smoothed from his forehead. "I love you," she whispered to the darkness, the words silent on her lips. "That is why I have to go." She slipped out the door. The pre-dawn air was cruelly cold. The mud had frozen overnight into a jagged, hard crust that crunched loudly under her boots. Every step sounded like a gunshot to her ears. She walked toward the road, shivering, intending to walk the 15 miles to the rail station in the next county. Eliza! The voice came from the porch behind her. It was not shouted. It was spoken with a calm, terrifying certainty. She froze. She closed her eyes, tears hot against her cold cheeks. She did not turn around. "Go back inside. Jonah," she said, her voice trembling. "You are not making it to the railhead," he said. She heard his boots on the wooden steps. Thud, thud, thud. He was coming for her. Not in this cold, not carrying a child. "I have to," she cried, spinning around to face him. He was standing 10 feet away, wearing only his trousers and a shirt, ignoring the freezing air. His hair was tousled from sleep, his eyes dark and intense. "They are going to take everything from you," she sobbed, the confession ripping out of her. "Don't you understand? I am the poison. Jonah, they will take your land. They will put you in jail. They will take the baby. If I leave, they will stop. You can have your life back." "My life?" Jonah laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He closed the distance between them, ignoring the mud. "Eliza, before I found you behind that livery, my life was waking up, working until my hands bled, and waiting to die so I could stop remembering my brother's face. That wasn't a life. That was a sentence." "I bring you nothing but shame," she shouted, pointing at her stomach. "This child, everyone knows, everyone stares. I will mark you as a fool forever." "Let them stare," Jonah said. He reached out and grabbed her shoulders, his grip hard enough to bruise, shaking her slightly. "I am done letting this town decide who I am, and I am done letting them decide who you are. Jonah, please!" "I do not want you to go," he said, his voice cracking. The roughness was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability. "If you leave, that is the ruin. That is the end of me. You are the only fire in this house. Eliza!" The wind whipped her hair across her face. She looked at him, stunned by the naked emotion in his eyes. Jonah took a breath. He looked down at the frozen ground, then back at her, slowly, deliberately. He lowered himself. He sank one knee into the sharp, frozen mud. He did not wince. He took her gloved hands in his bare, calloused ones. "I have no ring," he said, his voice thick. "I have no fortune. I have a name that is half cursed and a patch of dirt that fights me every day. But I swear to you, Eliza Ward, if you will have me, no one will ever touch you or that child again. I will be his father. I will be your husband, in name and in heart." Eliza stared at him. The world seemed to stop spinning. The cold vanished. You want to marry me," she whispered. "Knowing everything? Because of everything," Jonah said. "Marry me, Eliza. Let me claim you. Let me stand in front of them and tell them you are mine." She looked at this man, this scarred, lonely, dangerous man who knelt in the mud for her, and felt her heart shatter and reform into something stronger. "Yes," she choked out, falling to her knees to embrace him. "Yes, Jonah, yes." They did not wait for the mud to clear. They rode into Iron Creek 2 days later. The reception was exactly as they expected. As the wagon rolled down Main Street, conversations withered. Men stopped sweeping the boardwalks. Women pulled their children close and turned their backs. Jonah drove with his head high, his eyes fixed on the courthouse. Eliza sat beside him, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. She wore her best dress, brushed and mended, and she refused to look down. They climbed the steps to the courthouse. A man, one of the ranch hands from the Thorne estate, was leaning against the railing. As Eliza passed, he turned his head and spat a stream of brown tobacco juice. It landed inches from the hem of her skirt. Eliza flinched. Jonah stopped. He released Eliza's arm and turned to the man. The movement was fluid, predatory. He did not speak. He simply stepped into the man's space, his eyes flat and dead. The ranch hand, who had been smirking, suddenly looked like a rabbit facing a wolf. He swallowed hard and backed away, stumbling over his own boots. Jonah turned back to Eliza, offering his arm again. "Come." Judge Vance was in his chambers. He was an old man with skin like parchment and eyes that had seen too much of the frontier's cruelty. He looked up when they entered, his gaze traveling from Jonah's grim face to Eliza's rounded belly. "Jonah Hale," the judge sighed, taking off his spectacles. "And Miss Ward, I heard rumors you might be coming." "We are here to be married, Judge," Jonah said. "We want it done legally, tied tight so no man can undo it." The judge looked at them for a long moment. He saw the way Jonah placed himself slightly in front of her. He saw the way Eliza's hand gripped Jonah's sleeve. The judge was a man of the law, but he was also a man who knew that justice and the law were rarely the same thing. "The preacher won't like it," Vance said, reaching for his ledger. "The preacher is not the groom," Jonah said. The ceremony was short. There were no flowers, no music, just the scratching of a pen and the dusty smell of old law books. When the time came, Jonah reached into his vest pocket. He pulled out a ring. It was simple gold, thin and unadorned. "I bought this 5 years ago," Jonah said quietly, looking only at Eliza. "In St. Louis, I did not know who it was for. I hoped one day I might find a reason to have it." He slid it onto her finger. It fit as if it had been made for her hand. Eliza looked at the gold band, shining against her red, chapped skin. It felt heavy. It felt like armor. It felt like a promise. "I do," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I do," Jonah said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together, but it was the steadiest sound Eliza had ever heard. The judge signed the paper. "It is done. You are man and wife. And Mr. Hale? Sir, congratulations," the judge said softly. "It takes a brave man to find happiness in this territory. Try to keep it." The ride back to the ranch was different. The silence was not heavy. It was companionable. The ring on Eliza's finger caught the light of the setting sun. They ate a simple supper of cornbread and stew. The atmosphere in the cabin was charged, the air humming with a tension that was both terrifying and sweet. They were married. The legal papers sat on the mantelpiece, but the real marriage was yet to happen. As darkness fell, the wind picked up outside, a gentle whistling compared to the storms of winter. Jonah stood up and cleared the table. I will check the stock," he said, though he had already checked them twice. "I will be here," Eliza said. When he returned, the cabin was dim. Eliza had turned the lamp down low. She was standing by the bed. She had unbraided her hair. It fell in dark, heavy waves over her shoulders. Jonah bolted the door. He hung his hat on the peg. He turned to face her. The space between them felt charged with electricity. "Eliza," he said. He did not move closer. He stood by the door, giving her the width of the room. "You need to be sure. The paper is for the town. This is for us. If you are not ready, I will take the floor." Eliza looked at him. She saw the hesitation in his posture, the fear that he might frighten her. She saw the man who had slept on the floor for months to give her a bed. She saw the man who had knelt in the mud. She took a step toward him. "I am sure," she said. She took another step. She reached out and took his hand, the hand that had mended fences and held reins and, yes, took a life to save another. She brought it to her face, pressing her cheek against his palm. Then she guided his hand down. She moved it over the curve of her breast, down her ribs, until it rested gently over the swell of her stomach. "We are yours, Jonah," she whispered. "Both of us." Jonah let out a breath that sounded like a sob. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair. "Eliza," he groaned. He kissed her then, and it was not hesitant. It was a claim. He lifted her onto the bed. The undressing was slow, a trembling revelation. His fingers fumbled with the buttons of her dress. Her hands shook as she unfastened his shirt. When skin touched skin, the heat was shocking. Eliza felt a flash of old panic, the memory of the office, the smell of stale smoke. But Jonah was there. He sensed the tension in her muscles. He stopped. He waited. He kissed her eyelids, her jaw, the pulse at her throat, murmuring soft, incoherent words of worship until the fear melted away, replaced by a slow burning fire. Her body remembered pain, but tonight it learned something else. It learned reverence. Jonah moved over her, his weight supported on his elbows so he would not press on the baby. He looked down at her, his eyes wide and vulnerable in the lamplight. "Look at me," he whispered. "Only me." And when they finally joined, Eliza gasped, not in pain, but in a sudden, sharp realization of joy. It was healing. It was a defiance of every cruel word ever spoken to them. Later, they lay tangled together under the quilt. The lamp had burned out. The room was dark, save for the red glow of the stove embers. Jonah's arm was heavy across her waist, his hand resting possessively on her stomach. Eliza listened to the steady beat of his heart against her back. She was a ruined woman, they said. She smiled into the darkness. She had never felt so whole, but happiness in the West was a fragile thing, constantly hunted. 3 weeks after the wedding, the mud dried into hard ruts. The green grass of spring began to push through the gray earth. Jonah rode to the property line to check the fencing. When he returned, his face was grim. He tossed a crumpled newspaper onto the table. "What is it?" Eliza asked, looking up from her sewing. "The Cheyenne Daily paper," Jonah said. "The supply rider dropped it off." He pointed to a small notice in the social column. "Mr. Caleb Thorne, son of Iron Creek banker Jedediah Thorne, is set to return from his travels in the East. He is expected to arrive by rail at the end of the month." Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. Her hand went instinctively to her belly, where the child kicked, a sudden, sharp movement. "He is coming back," she whispered. Jonah walked over to the mantelpiece. He picked up the box of cartridges and checked the weight of it. "Let him come," Jonah said softly. But looking at his back, Eliza saw the tension returning to his shoulders. The peace of the winter was over. The storm was no longer weather. It was a man on a train, bringing the past with him to burn their future to the ground. The spring of 1879 did not bring the gentle unfolding of flowers. It brought violence. The Wyoming Territory, having held its breath through the long, white silence of winter, exhaled with a fury that shook the very earth. It began with the wind. It dried the gumbo mud into concrete ruts within days, sucking the moisture from the new grass until the plains were a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The sky turned a sickly, bruised yellow in the afternoons, heavy with static electricity that made the hair on Jonah's arms stand up. Then came the dry lightning. It struck in the middle of the night, a jagged tear in the fabric of the dark, slamming into the earth 3 miles west of the ranch. Jonah was awake instantly, the smell of ozone and burning sage hitting him before he even reached the window. "Fire," he said, the word flat and terrifying. Eliza sat up, clutching the quilt to her chest. Her belly was huge now, tight and low. She was 8 months along, and moving was a labor in itself. "Is it close?" "Close enough," Jonah said, already pulling on his boots. "The wind is driving it east. If I do not turn the herd, they will be trapped in the box canyon." He moved with frantic efficiency, grabbing his gloves and his hat. "Stay here. Eliza, fill every bucket and pot with water from the pump. Soak the blankets. If the sparks jump the creek, you wet the roof. Do you understand?" "I understand," she said, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. "Be careful, Jonah." He did not stop to kiss her. He grabbed a heavy canvas sack to beat out flames and vanished into the orange-tinged darkness. Eliza worked until her back screamed. She pumped water until her hands were raw, dragging buckets into the house, soaking the heavy wool blankets. Outside, the horizon was a terrifying, living line of gold and blood red. The smoke rolled in, thick and acrid, stinging her eyes and coating her tongue with the taste of ash. She stood on the porch, a bucket in hand, watching the distant silhouettes of cattle running against the glow. She could hear the lowing of the herd, a sound of panic that carried over the wind. Jonah did not return until dawn. When he rode into the yard, he looked like a specter risen from hell. His face was black with soot, his eyebrows singed off, his shirt torn and stained with blood where a branch had whipped him. His horse was trembling, covered in white lather and ash. Eliza hurried down the steps as fast as she dared, holding a dipper of water. Jonah slid from the saddle and nearly collapsed, catching himself on the hitching post. "The herd?" she asked, offering him the water. He drank greedily, water streaming down his blackened chin. Before he spoke, "We lost 20 heads, maybe 30. They panicked and broke through the south fence, running straight into a blind draw. The smoke got them." He looked at the barn. His shoulders slumped under a crushing weight. 30 heads. "Eliza, that is half the profit for the year. With the loan payment due in October, I do not know if we will make it." Eliza reached out, touching his arm. Her heart twisted with a familiar, poisonous guilt. "It is me," she whispered. "Since I came here, it has been one thing after another." "The town, the bank. Now this. I am a curse on you. Jonah!" Jonah straightened up. He wiped his face with a dirty sleeve, leaving a streak of raw, red skin. He grabbed her hand, his grip fierce. "Stop it," he rasped. "This is the West. Eliza, the land does not care about you or me. It burns because the grass is dry and the lightning struck. It freezes because it is winter. Do not give yourself the power of God to control the weather just to punish yourself." He kissed her forehead, tasting smoke. "We are alive. The house is standing. The rest is just money." But Eliza saw the fear in his eyes that he tried to hide. The margin for survival, already thin, had just become razor sharp. The fire was only the herald. 2 weeks later, the human threat returned, arriving not on the wind, but on the train from the east. Eliza was in the garden, trying to salvage the early peas from the heat, when Tom Miller pulled his wagon up to the gate. He held a bundle of mail, his face grave. "Afternoon, Mrs. Hale," he said, tipping his hat. He called her Mrs. Hale now, a small courtesy that always made Eliza's throat tight with gratitude. "Good afternoon, Mr. Miller," she said, straightening up and pressing a hand to the small of her back. "Is there news?" "There is," Miller said reluctantly. He handed her a stack of letters, mostly bills, and hesitated. "I was in town this morning, picking up grain. The train came in." Eliza went still. "And?" "The banker's son is back," Miller said quietly. "Caleb Thorne. He stepped off the platform, looking like he owned the railroad, wearing a suit that costs more than my farm. I reckon." The name hit Eliza like a physical blow. The blood drained from her face, leaving her dizzy. The baby gave a violent kick, as if sensing her distress. Did he say anything?" "He was holding court in the saloon an hour later," Miller said, looking disgusted. "Buying drinks for everyone, laughing about his grand tour. But I heard him talking to the preacher outside the livery. He asked if the trash was still squatting on the Hale place." Miller leaned down, his voice lowering to a whisper. "He looks scared, ma'am. Underneath all that fancy talk, he looks like a man who knows he has a wolf scratching at his door. A scared man with money is a dangerous thing." Eliza nodded, unable to speak. She clutched the letters so tightly they crumpled in her fist. That evening, the tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut. Jonah sat at the table, cleaning his Winchester rifle. He had been cleaning it for an hour, the smell of gun oil heavy in the room. "He is back," Eliza said. It was not a question. "I know," Jonah said, not looking up. "Miller told me. What are we going to do?" "We do nothing," Jonah said, sliding the bolt back into place with a sharp, metallic click. "We live our lives. If he comes here, I will deal with him." "He will not come here," Eliza said, pacing the floor. "He is a coward. Jonah, he fights with whispers and money." "Cowards hire brave men to do their dirty work," Jonah replied grimly. The threat materialized 3 days later. Jonah had ridden out to check the water levels in the creek, which were rising dangerously fast after a sudden shift in the weather. He met a rider on the boundary line, Old Man Jeb, a trapper who owed allegiance to no one. Jeb spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground and looked at Jonah with milky eyes. "You got trouble brewing, Hale. I was in the saloon last night. Caleb Thorne was deep in his cups. He was talking to 2 drifters, hard men, the kind that rent their guns by the day. I heard him say he needed to take care of a little problem before it ruined his reputation. Jonah felt a cold rage settle in his gut, sharp and deadly. Did he say my name? He said the whore's bastard needed to disappear before it drew its first breath, Jeb said. And the man guarding her needed to be taught a lesson in humility. Jonah rode back to the ranch at a gallop. He stormed into the house, his face pale with fury, and went straight for the heavy box of ammunition on the shelf. "What is it?" Eliza asked, dropping her sewing. "I am going to town," Jonah said, shoving handfuls of cartridges into his pockets. "I am going to finish this today." "No!" Eliza screamed. She threw herself between him and the door. "Jonah, stop! He is planning to kill us! Eliza!" Jonah roared, the control he had maintained for months finally shattering. "He is hiring men to come here and hurt you, to kill the child. I will not sit here and wait for them to kick down my door. If you ride into town and kill him, you will hang." Eliza grabbed his lapels, shaking him. "The judge, the sheriff, the banker, they are all his people. They will see it as murder. They will hang you, and I will be left alone with this baby." "Is that what you want, to leave us alone?" "I will not let you live in fear," Jonah said, his voice cracking. He put his hands over hers, trying to pry them off his coat. "I promise to protect you." "Then protect me by staying here," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Guard the door. Keep us safe. But do not ride out to be a martyr. Please, Jonah. I cannot lose you. I cannot." Jonah looked down at her. He saw the terror in her eyes, not of Caleb, but of a life without him. The rage slowly receded, replaced by a desperate, aching love. He slumped, letting his forehead rest against hers. "All right," he whispered. "All right, I stay, but the rifle stays loaded by the door." The attack did not come that night. Instead, the sky opened up. The spring rains, delayed by the drought, arrived all at once. It was a deluge, a solid sheet of gray water that hammered the roof like buckshot. For 2 days, it rained without ceasing. The dry earth, unable to absorb the sudden onslaught, turned the runoff into flash floods. The creek behind the cabin rose and rose. By the second night, the sound of the water was a deafening roar. Jonah paced the floor, watching the water creep up the banks. "It is going to crest," he said, shouting to be heard over the rain. "It is going to come into the house. We have to move the dry goods to the loft." They worked in a frantic rhythm. Jonah hauled sacks of flour and sugar up the ladder. Eliza cleared the lower shelves, packing the pots and pans into crates. The water began to seep under the door around midnight, cold. Muddy ribbons that spread across the floorboards. "The tools," Jonah said. "I left the expensive saw and the new harness on the porch. If the water takes them, we cannot replace them." "I will get them," Eliza said, grabbing a shawl. "No, you stay." "I am closer," she yelled, already opening the door. The wind ripped the door from her hand, slamming it against the wall. The rain blew in, soaking her instantly. Eliza stepped out onto the porch. The water was already swirling around the bottom step, dark and angry. She grabbed the harness, throwing it inside. She reached for the saw. Her boot hit a patch of slick, wet mud that had washed up onto the wood. She went down hard. She landed on her side, but the impact jarred her entire body. A sharp, tearing pain ripped through her abdomen, different from the ache of the fall. It was a contraction, but it was not the practice pains she had felt for weeks. This was a vice grip, a crushing pressure that stole her breath. "Jonah!" she screamed. He was there in a second, splashing through the water on the floor. He found her trying to crawl back inside, clutching her belly, her face twisted in agony. "Eliza!" He scooped her up, kicking the saw inside, and slammed the door against the storm with his shoulder. He carried her to the bed, which was raised on blocks and still dry. He laid her down, peeling the wet shawl from her shoulders. "Did you hit the baby?" he demanded, his hands frantic on her stomach. "No!" she gasped, arching her back as another wave of pain hit her. "No, I fell on my hip. But Jonah, it is time. The water. I think my water broke." Jonah looked at the puddle forming beneath her on the quilt. It was not just rainwater. "It is too early," he said, panic edging his voice. "You have a month left. The baby does not care about the calendar," she cried, gripping his hand until her knuckles turned white. "Jonah, it hurts. It hurts so much." He brushed the wet hair from her forehead. "I am here. I am not going anywhere. We will do this. I have birthed calves. Eliza, it is nature. We will be all right." He moved to the stove, shoving wood into the firebox with trembling hands to boil water. He tried to remember what the midwife in town had told him weeks ago, just in case. Clean rags, hot water, keep her warm. The cabin was a siege tower. Outside, the floodwaters roared. Inside, Eliza's cries mixed with the thunder. Jonah was wringing out a cloth to wipe her face when the sound of hooves cut through the storm. He froze. He looked at the door. "Jonah?" Eliza whispered, sensing his fear. "Hush!" he said, reaching for the rifle he had propped against the wall. The door did not open. It exploded inward. A boot kicked the latch mechanism, shattering the wood. The door swung wide, banging against the wall. 3 men stood in the opening, silhouetted by a flash of lightning. The rain drove in behind them. In the center stood Caleb Thorne. He wore a yellow oilskin slicker that streamed water. His expensive hat was ruined. His face was pale, his eyes wild and bloodshot. But he held a heavy revolver in his hand. Flanking him were 2 men Jonah did not know, rough, bearded men with the look of hired killers, smelling of wet wool and whiskey. "Well," Caleb shouted over the rain, stepping into the room. "Looks like we caught you at a bad time. Hail." Jonah stood between the bed and the door, the rifle leveled at Caleb's chest. "Get out." "I do not think so." Caleb sneered. He looked past Jonah to the bed, where Eliza lay curled in pain. A look of revulsion crossed his handsome features. "Look at her, like a sick animal. I told you, boys, I told you she was trash. You take one more step, and I will put a hole in you the size of a silver dollar," Jonah said. His voice was steady, devoid of fear, filled only with a lethal promise. "You shoot me, and my men cut you down," Caleb said, his voice wavering slightly but regaining strength as he gestured to his guards. "We are here to clean up a mess. Hail, I am taking her. We are going to take a little ride to the river, and when the baby comes... Well, the orphanage in Denver is too good for a bastard. The river can have it." Eliza let out a low, guttural moan of terror. "Caleb, please, I never told anyone. I swear." "You exist," Caleb screamed, his composure cracking. "As long as you exist, people talk. I am not going to lose my inheritance because of a shop girl." "Take her," Caleb ordered the men. The man on the left, a giant with a scar across his nose, lunged. Jonah pulled the trigger. The rifle roared in the small space, deafening. The bullet took the scarred man in the shoulder, spinning him around, but before Jonah could lever another round, the second man tackled him. The rifle skittered across the floor, sliding into a puddle of rainwater. Jonah and the second mercenary crashed into the table, splintering the wood. The man had a knife, a long Bowie blade that flashed in the lamplight. He slashed at Jonah, cutting a line across his forearm. Jonah roared, ignoring the pain. He drove his knee into the man's groin, doubling him over, then brought his clasped hands down like a hammer on the back of the man's neck. Across the room, Caleb saw his chance. He holstered his gun, too cowardly to shoot while Jonah was grappling, and lunged for the bed. He grabbed Eliza by the arm, digging his fingers into her flesh. "Get up, you whore! No!" Eliza screamed. Another contraction seized her, paralyzing her body. But her instinct to protect her child was stronger than the pain. As Caleb tried to drag her off the mattress, Eliza's hand closed around the heavy brass candlestick on the nightstand. She swung it with every ounce of strength she possessed. The brass base connected with Caleb's ear with a sickening crunch. He shrieked, stumbling back, clutching the side of his head. Blood welled up between his fingers. "You bitch!" he sobbed. Jonah had finished the second man. He had thrown him headfirst into the iron stove. The man lay groaning, smelling of singed hair. The first man, shot in the shoulder, was scrambling out the door, slipping in the mud, abandoning his pay. Jonah turned. He saw Caleb raising his hand to strike Eliza. A sound tore from Jonah's throat that was not human. It was the sound of a wolf protecting its mate. He crossed the room in 2 strides. He grabbed Caleb by the back of his oilskin coat and hurled him backward. Caleb flew across the room, crashing into the wall beside the door. Caleb tried to pull his gun, but Jonah was on him. Jonah kicked the pistol from his hand, sending it sliding into the floodwater. He grabbed Caleb by the throat and slammed him against the logs. "You wanted to touch her?" Jonah snarled, his face inches from Caleb's. "You wanted to hurt my wife?" He punched Caleb. It was a brutal, efficient blow that broke Caleb's nose. Caleb slumped, but Jonah held him up by the throat. The rage that had been building for 6 months, the anger at the brother he killed, the anger at the town, the anger at the injustice of the world, it all focused on this one terrified, entitled man. Jonah pulled his hunting knife from his belt. The blade glinted in the lightning flash. He pressed it against Caleb's throat. Caleb's eyes bulged, bubbling with blood and snot. "Please," Caleb gurgled. "Please, die," Jonah whispered. He tightened his grip. He was going to do it. He was going to open this man's throat and let the flood wash him away. It would be justice. It will be over. "Jonah!" The voice cut through the red haze. It was weak, strained, but it was her. "Jonah, no!" Eliza cried from the bed. She was clutching the sheets, her face gray. "Do not do it! Do not become a murderer again! Not for him! Not for him!" Jonah froze. The knife point pricked Caleb's skin, drawing a single drop of blood. He looked at Caleb, this pathetic, weeping man who had caused so much pain. Then he looked at Eliza. She was terrified, not of Caleb, but of what Jonah was about to become. "You are the man who stops the monsters," she had told him. If he killed Caleb now, in cold blood, he would not be stopping a monster. He would be one. Jonah's hands shook. He took a jagged breath. "You are not worth hanging," Jonah spat. He pulled the knife away, but he did not let go. He drew back his fist one last time and delivered a blow that knocked Caleb Thorne out cold before he even hit the floor. Jonah stood over the unconscious body, his chest heaving, the knife still in his hand. The rain blew in through the open door, washing the blood from his knuckles. He turned to the bed. Eliza was weeping, holding her stomach. "It is over," Jonah gasped, dropping the knife. He rushed to the door, grabbing the rope he used for roping calves. He bound Caleb's hands and feet with savage tightness, then dragged him into the corner like a sack of grain. He slammed the door shut and shoved the heavy chest of drawers in front of it. Then he ran to the bed. He fell to his knees, taking Eliza's hands. "I am here," he said, his voice breaking. "I am here." Eliza gripped his hands. "The baby," she whispered, her eyes losing focus. "The baby is coming, now." Jonah looked around the wrecked room. The table was smashed. There was blood on the floor. A bound man lay in the corner. The storm raged outside. "Okay," Jonah said, terrified and fierce. "Okay, let him come. We are ready." The room was a wreckage of violence and shadows, but the terror that gripped Jonah now had nothing to do with the men he had fought. It was the sound of Eliza's breathing, shallow, ragged, and edged with a pain that was coming too fast. He knelt beside the bed, his hands stained with the blood of the fight, hovering over her. "Eliza?" She gripped the sheets, her knuckles white. "Something is wrong," she gasped, her eyes wide and dark with panic. "There is too much blood. It is too soon." Jonah looked at the mattress. The stain spreading beneath her was not just the waters of birth. It was bright red. Fear, cold and absolute, washed over him. He knew cattle, and he knew horses. But this was a fragile human life, the life that held his entire world together. If she stayed here, in this flooded, broken cabin without help, she would die. "We have to go," Jonah said, his voice rough but steady. "I am taking you to town, to the midwife." "The storm," she whispered. To hell with the storm, Jonah swore softly. He moved with the desperate speed of a man racing death. He ran into the rain, splashing through the mud to the barn. The horses were spooked, rolling their eyes at the thunder. But Jonah's hands were firm. He hitched the team to the wagon in record time, his fingers flying over the wet leather buckles. He returned to the house. Caleb Thorne was still unconscious in the corner, a lump of expensive wool and entitlement. Jonah did not hesitate. He dragged the banker's son out into the mud and heaved him over the back of his saddle horse, tying him down like a sack of meal. He would not leave the snake behind to wake up and shoot them in the back. Then he went for Eliza. He wrapped her in dry blankets, cushioned the wagon bed with every quilt they owned, and lifted her. She cried out as he moved her, a sound that tore at his heart. "Hold on," he murmured against her hair as he laid her in the wagon. "Just hold on to me." The ride was a descent into madness. The world was a blur of driving rain and lightning that turned the night into a strobe-lit nightmare. The mud was hub-deep, sucking at the wheels, fighting every inch of progress. At the creek crossing, the water was swirling black and angry, licking at the floorboards of the wagon. The horses balked, terrified of the rushing current. "Ha!" Jonah shouted, cracking the reins, willing his own strength into the animals. "Get up!" They plunged in. The wagon lurched, threatening to tip. Eliza screamed, a raw, tearing sound that was lost in the roar of the thunder. Jonah reached back, grabbing her hand, his grip bruising. "I have got you," he roared over the storm. "I will not let you go." They fought their way up the slick bank on the other side, the wheels spinning in the gumbo before finding purchase. For 10 miles, Jonah drove like a demon. Every bump was a torture for Eliza. She squeezed his arm until her nails broke the skin, her face a mask of agony illuminated by the lightning flashes. She was bleeding. She was terrified, but she did not stop fighting. Dawn broke not with sunlight, but with a gray, weeping light that revealed the town of Iron Creek. It was a sorry procession that rolled down Main Street. The wagon was caked in mud, the horses blowing hard, foam flecking their chests. Jonah sat on the bench, hatless, his shirt torn, his face smeared with blood and soot. Behind the wagon trailed the saddle horse, bearing the slumped, bound figure of Caleb Thorne. They stopped in front of the boarding house. Jonah jumped down, his boots splashing in the puddles. He did not care who saw him. He did not care about the law or the whispers. He cared only for the woman moaning in the wagon bed. "Help!" Jonah bellowed, his voice echoing off the wet storefronts. "I need a midwife, now!" Doors opened. People spilled out, drawn by the spectacle. The banker, Jedediah Thorne, emerged from his brick house down the street, adjusting his spectacles. The Reverend Silas stepped out of the church, clutching his lapels. When they saw Caleb tied across the horse, a collective gasp went through the crowd. "That is my son!" the banker shouted, his face turning purple. "Sheriff, arrest that man! He has kidnapped my boy!" "He has lost his mind!" the preacher cried, pointing a shaking finger at Jonah. "I told you he was a devil! He has come to murder us all!" Jonah ignored them. He reached into the wagon and lifted Eliza out. She was limp, her dress soaked with rain and blood. "Get out of my way!" Jonah snarled at the crowd gathering around him. "Put her down! Hail!" the sheriff shouted, hand on his gun. "And untie Mr. Thorne!" Jonah turned. He held Eliza against his chest, shielding her from their stares. He looked at the sheriff, then at the banker, his eyes burning with a fire that made them step back. "Your son," Jonah shouted, his voice carrying to every corner of the street, "broke into my home last night. He brought hired guns. He attacked my wife while she was in labor. Liar!" the banker screamed. "He tried to drag her out into the storm," Jonah continued, the truth pouring out of him like molten iron. "He came to kill her and the child to cover his shame. He forced himself on her in your bank. Thorne! He assaulted her. And when she tried to speak, you called her a whore." The crowd murmured, the sound rippling like wind through wheat. Eliza stirred in his arms. She lifted her head, her face ghostly pale. She saw the banker, she saw the crowd, and in the midst of her pain, she found a spark of the steel that had kept her alive all winter. "The back room!" she gasped, her voice thin but audible in the sudden silence. "The velvet drapes! The smell of bay rum! He tore my sleeve." She looked at the banker. "You saw the bruise on his face, Mr. Thorne. I put it there when I fought him off. You knew, you always knew." The banker opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "Enough!" A woman pushed through the crowd. It was Mrs. Higgins, the landlady who had turned Eliza out months ago. Beside her was Mrs. Gable, the midwife. "She is bleeding out." "Mrs." Gable snapped, ignoring the men. "Stop your gawking and help me. Get her inside. Upstairs now!" The sheer authority of the women broke the spell. Two other women, wives of ranchers who had once whispered about Eliza, stepped forward, their face etched with shame and concern. They helped Jonah carry Eliza up the narrow stairs of the boarding house. The room upstairs was small and smelled of lavender and old dust. They laid Eliza on the bed. "Out," the midwife ordered Jonah. "Men have no place here." "I am not leaving her," Jonah said, gripping the bedpost. "You are leaving so I can save her life." "Mrs." Gable said sternly. "Go!" Jonah backed into the hallway. The door closed, shutting him out. He paced the length of the narrow corridor, 4 steps one way, 4 steps back. His fists were clenched so tight his fingernails bit into his palms. He could hear the voices inside, low, urgent commands, and then Eliza's cries. They were sounds of raw suffering that tore through him. Every scream felt like a judgment. He had failed to protect her from the stress, from the fear, from the attack. If she died, he knew with absolute certainty that he would not survive it. He would wither away like grass in a drought. Minutes stretched into hours. Downstairs, he could hear shouting, the heavy tread of boots, the sheriff's voice. He did not care. Let them hang him. Let them rot. "Jonah!" It was Eliza's voice, high and terrified. The door opened a crack. "Mrs." Gable looked out, her face sweaty and grim. "She's asking for you. Make it quick." Jonah rushed in. The room was hot, filled with the smell of blood and iron. Eliza looked small in the bed, her dark hair plastered to her skull, her eyes sunken. He fell to his knees beside her, taking her hand. It was cold. "I'm here," he choked out. "I am right here, Eliza." "I cannot," she whispered, tears leaking from the corners of her eyes. "I am too tired. Jonah, it hurts too much." "You can," Jonah said fiercely, pressing her hand to his cheek. "You are the strongest woman I have ever known. You survived the winter. You survived the fire. You survived him. You do not give up now. Do you hear me?" He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her. "We are a family, Eliza. No matter what blood runs in that child's veins, he is mine because he is yours. Do not leave me alone." Eliza looked at him. She saw the love in his eyes, a love that had been forged in the hardest winter the territory had seen. She took a breath, a shuddering gasp. "Okay," she whispered. "One more time. Dear," the midwife urged. "Push." Eliza squeezed Jonah's hand until he thought the bones would break. She threw her head back and screamed, a sound of defiance and life. And then silence, followed by a thin, wailing cry. The sound cut through the air like a miracle. It was the sound of new life asserting itself against the void. Jonah's knees gave way. He slumped against the side of the bed, burying his face in the mattress, his shoulders shaking with sobs he could no longer hold back. "It is a boy," the midwife announced, her voice thick with emotion. "A big, healthy boy." Downstairs, the reckoning was waiting. Jonah walked down the steps an hour later. He had washed the blood from his face, though the exhaustion remained etched in every line. The sheriff was there, along with Judge Vance, who had been summoned from his breakfast. Caleb Thorne was sitting in a chair, unbound now but looking like a trapped rat, nursing a broken nose and a bruised jaw. "He tried to kill me," Caleb shouted as soon as he saw Jonah. "He is a maniac." "Sit down. Caleb," Judge Vance said, his voice dry as dust. The judge looked at Jonah. "Sheriff tells me you claim self-defense. And you claim Mr. Thorne here attacked your wife." "I do not claim it," Jonah said, his voice ragged. "I witnessed it. And so did the two men he hired. One is lying in my cabin with a broken leg. The other is running for the border." "Lies," the banker blustered. "My son was nowhere near that shack." "I saw him," a voice spoke up from the back of the room. The crowd parted. It was Arthur Penhaligon, a mousy little man who had worked as a clerk at the bank for 10 years. He looked terrified, wringing his hat in his hands, but he stepped forward. "Arthur?" the banker snapped. "What are you doing?" "I saw him," Arthur repeated, his voice trembling. 3 months ago, in the bank, I saw Caleb follow Miss Ward into the back office. I heard her say no. I heard the struggle." He looked at the floor. "I did not say anything because I needed the job, but I cannot watch them hurt her anymore. It is not right." The silence in the room was absolute. Caleb's face went the color of old ash. The banker slumped as if his strings had been cut. Judge Vance looked at Caleb. He looked at the banker. Then he looked at Jonah, standing tall and unbroken in his muddy boots. "Sheriff," the judge said quietly, "lock Mr. Thorne up. The charge is attempted kidnapping and assault. We will see about the rest." "You cannot do this!" Caleb shrieked as the sheriff hauled him up. "Do you know who I am?" "I know exactly who you are." "Son," the judge said, "you are a man who is about to learn that money does not buy everything in this territory." As they dragged Caleb out, the preacher stood in the corner, clutching his Bible. He looked at Jonah, then at the floor, unable to meet the gaze of the man he had condemned. The congregants who had filled the room began to drift away, their whispers now directed not at the ruined woman, but at the ruined reputation of the town's golden boy. The change did not happen all at once. Prejudice is a weed with deep roots, but the frost had broken. 2 days later, while Eliza was resting in the boarding house, Mrs. Gable knocked on the door. She held a small, knitted cap in her hands. "For the little one," she said gruffly, refusing to look Eliza in the eye. "It is cold on the ride back to the ranch." Eliza took the cap. Her fingers brushed the woman's hand. "Thank you." We did not know," Mrs. Gable stammered. "About the violence. We thought, well, it does not matter what we think. It was wrong. It was a clumsy apology, rough around the edges. But it was sincere." When Jonah brought the wagon around to take them home a week later, the street was not empty. People stopped to watch. They did not cheer. They were not that kind of people. But they nodded. A rancher touched the brim of his hat as Jonah passed. The store owner, Mr. Abernathy, stepped out and placed a sack of coffee in the back of the wagon without asking for payment. "For the inconvenience," he muttered. Eliza sat on the seat beside Jonah, the baby wrapped tightly in her arms. She looked at the town that had tried to break her. She did not feel anger anymore. She felt only a distant pity for their smallness. "Ready to go home?" Jonah asked, taking the reins. She looked up at him, at the gray at his temples and the steadfast line of his jaw. "Yes," she said. "Let's go home." The seasons turned, as they always did. The gumbo dried to dust, the grass turned gold, and the wind blew ceaselessly across the plains. 6 months later, the ranch house still leaned a little to the south, but the roof was patched and the fences were tight. The herd was smaller, but they were fat on the summer grass. It was evening. The sun was setting in a riot of purple and orange, setting the western horizon on fire. Jonah sat on the porch steps, whittling a piece of pine. Eliza sat in the rocking chair behind him, in her arms. The baby, named Samuel, after the brother Jonah had finally forgiven, cooed and reached for the button on her dress. He was a chubby, happy child with dark eyes and a grip like iron. He did not look like Caleb Thorne. He looked like a boy who was loved. Jonah stopped whittling. He reached out a finger, and the baby grabbed it, tugging with surprising strength. Jonah laughed, a low, rusty sound that came easier these days. "He is going to be a handful," Jonah said. "He takes after his father." Eliza smiled. Jonah looked back at her. The scars of the past year were still there, in the lines around her eyes, in the way she still flinched sometimes at sudden loud noises. But she was not the frightened girl he had found behind the livery. She was a woman made of iron and grace. Eliza leaned forward, resting her hand on Jonah's shoulder. She wore his old buffalo coat against the evening chill. It swallowed her frame, but she loved the weight of it. "We made it," she whispered. Jonah covered her hand with his own. He looked out at the land, harsh, beautiful, indifferent. It would try to kill them again. There would be blizzards. There would be drought. There would be wolves. But looking at his wife and the child he had claimed as his own, Jonah knew they would stand. "We made it," he agreed. Later, as the stars wheeled overhead in the vast, cold sky, they sat by the fire. Jonah read aloud from a month-old newspaper, his voice a steady rumble. Eliza nursed the baby, her eyes heavy with contentment. They did not need to speak of love. It was there in the wood piled high against the cold. It was there in the mended fence. It was there in the way Jonah checked the door lock every night, and the way Eliza smoothed the hair back from his forehead. They were two broken things that had mended each other, and as the wind howled outside, searching for a way in, it found the house sealed tight, anchored by a bond that was stronger than fear, deeper than blood, and more enduring than the wild. Cruel West itself. Thank you for listening to this story. It has been a journey through the snow and the mud, and I am grateful you rode along with Eliza and Jonah until the very end. I would love to hear where you are listening from. Are you in the bustling city, or out somewhere with a wide-open sky? Please leave a comment below and share your thoughts on the story. Did the ending satisfy you? What did you think of Jonah's choice? If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West. There are many more stories to tell from the frontier, stories of grit, survival, and love found in the most unlikely places. Until next time, keep your powder dry